Hello there, Blogging Heads audience. This is Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. And I am here with Bret Weinstein, who is professor of biology at Evergreen State College in Washington, and who has been at the center of some controversy. He's become a famous guy. We're going to be talking about all of that. But welcome to The Glenn Show, Bret.
Thanks, Glenn. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So you are a professor of biology. Why don't we begin by you telling us a little bit about, what you work on, what you teach about, what's your intellectual life like before we get to talking about all this political stuff.
Great. If I forget anything, remind me. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. I trained with Bob Trivers and then Richard Alexander, who are both well-known in evolutionary circles. And I started thinking about questions of adaptive evolution, what causes it, what sorts of patterns it produces. I became focused on the fact that there are a number of kinds of puzzles in adaptive evolution that we evolutionists have gone around on for decades and not really made headway. And I began to wonder why that was and whether there was something fundamentally wrong in our approach to those questions. This was in graduate school, and I ended up settling on an approach to evolutionary biology that it had not been systematically done before, which involved thinking about trade-offs, where evolution has to choose between desirable characteristics, and interesting patterns emerge when that's the case. So I've been working on those questions and that rubric for studying them for decades now, and I have become very interested in taking that toolkit that works for really any sorts of creature, from plants to insects to mammals, and figuring out how to apply it responsibly to human beings, which are in many ways evolutionarily quite exceptional. So I've started thinking about what human beings are and how they evolve and what implications it has for us modern folks who live in an environment that doesn't look like any of the environments that our ancestors lived in. So I've been studying that as my primary focus, and I'm lucky enough that working at Evergreen means that we essentially have complete freedom to teach the subject matter that we wish to teach and to teach in the manner that we wish to teach. So I've been using that same material as fodder for teaching, and I'll switch the particular emphasis from one year to the next, but it's very much the same sets of questions and the same toolkit applied to different topics.
Trade-offs. Now that word is music to my ears. Being a professional economist, that's what we do. But we are usually thinking of decision makers who are, consciously and rationally weighing the alternatives before them and trading off the benefits and costs in a way that suits them best, and use that account of human behavior to try to explain what goes on in the economy. But I would imagine that evolution is different. That is, the management of trade-offs under evolutionary pressures works differently. And I wonder how do you think about what you're doing relative to what we economists with our models of optimization and so forth are up to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I should say that my sister-in-law and my brother are economists. My brother started out as a mathematician, but he's refashioned himself in part as an economist. So I have a lot of exposure to economic thinking. And you might be surprised how similar, actually, the rules of choice and trade-offs are in economic space and evolutionary space. Really, I think of economic space as a special case where things are simpler because you have a bottom line that returns in a single currency. But at some level, whether you're talking about a tree deciding how to allocate resources to leaves and trunk and roots, or whether you're talking about a firm deciding to allocate resources to investigating possible new niches or deploying products or advertising what it makes, the rules are very similar. So learning how to spot the similarities is a little bit tough, but overall, anytime you have a system in which there's a goal, in the case of economics, it might be profit. In the case of biology, it might be fitness. But anytime you have a complex system and you have a goal, you get many of the same patterns emerging.
Where did you do your graduate work, Bret?
University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Oh, I was on the faculty there a long time ago, between 79 and 82.
Yeah,
I know I don't look that old, audience, but hey, that's the reality. Anyway, Bret, I mean, forgive me for interrupting our reflections on all these elegant and esoteric ideas, but unfortunately, the reality of life day to day intercedes. And let me just introduce the topic for our discussion by reiterating what I'm sure almost everybody listening to us knows, and I'll try to do it very briefly, that you became at the center of a firestorm of controversy at your college because when the traditional annual day of absence came to be observed this year, the organizers, and I should say the day of absence is for African American or students of color more broadly, and perhaps staff and faculty as well, to not appear on college on that particular day as a way of emphasizing the importance of the communities of color to the workings of the college. That's my understanding of it. But on this particular year, a request was made that rather than the students of color and faculty and staff absenting themselves, that the white students, faculty, and staff would absent themselves on this day of absence. And you publicly objected to that, arguing as a matter of principle that there was a fundamental difference between a group of people deciding that they would not come for the reasons that they might have, on the one hand, and a group of people deciding that other people shouldn't come based upon the color of those other people. You objected to that. People objected to your objecting to it. Events unfolded that I won't try to discuss. I mean, you could discuss them if you will, but I think everybody knows about them. And you find yourself, being protested against, being vilified, being public enemy number one, and being a piece of shit. I believe I heard somebody call you that. I don't imagine that's very pleasant to be called. There's other conflict on the campus. We could go into it, but we're not going to bother. You tell me in our previous discussion that is a kind of these day of absence inspired events, a kind of tip of the iceberg of stuff that's been going on at Evergreen State. And that I don't think our listening audience will necessarily know very much about. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking just a few moments to fill us in on how it is that this day of absence event, like a spark setting off a forest fire, there must have been a lot of dry timber, if you'll let me exploit that metaphor. What was the timber? What's going on more deeply in terms of race relations at Evergreen State?
Yeah, well, one correction first. My objection to day of absence was not public. It was sent to the faculty and staff distribution list, which did contain some students who had staff positions. But it became public at the point that our school newspaper decided to publish my email, thinking that my email revealed obvious racism. And so that is what caused day of absence and my position on its change this year to become public.
I see.
So your larger question, though, is why was there so much tinder lying around to catch fire when the spark broke things loose? And it's a very important question, and I don't think it is particular to Evergreen in any way, although I do think that Evergreen was maybe a bit ahead of the curve on a particular trajectory. What's happened is, at least at Evergreen, I think there is a tendency to be very reflexive and binary about certain issues. So if, for example, there is an issue that has a dynamic surrounding gender, and one side is arguably, has to do with queer or trans or gay issues, there is a reflexive desire to jump on board as a recognition of, the difficulty that people in those less common categories face. But anytime you have people reflexively jumping on board, drawing the lines too starkly and reflexively jumping on board, there's the opportunity to abuse those categories too, and to load virtually anything you want under a label, and then you have a ready-made group of people who will defend it vehemently, thinking that they are defending something noble, but not checking too carefully about what it is that they are in fact supporting. So at Evergreen, what we've had is a series of proposals surrounding what has been described as equity. But when one looks at those proposals in depth, they aren't really about equity. In fact, if you look at them carefully, they are about creating permanent structural inequities surrounding race. So if, like me, you subscribe to the idea that our objective ought to be to neutralize the benefits that arise from race, then you find yourself opposing these equity proposals.
Excuse me a minute, Bret.
Oh, no.
This is my granddaughter, Ariel. Ariel, say hi to Bret.
Hi there.
And she's about to depart from our vacation house where we've been spending the better part of a week together, and she's come to say goodbye to Poppy.
Do you need some time?
No, I don't. We're going to say goodbye. So, thanks. Can I have a kiss? Thank you. Others may come, audience, and we'll receive them with love. But okay, Bret, you were saying that the equity issue can, if I understood you, sometimes be I don't want to put words in your mouth, can sometimes be an instrument through which interested parties are trying to reorganize the structures of governance, campus life, pedagogy, on behalf of things that are actually not equity at all. Could you give an example?
Sure. So, for example, what's been called this is now, the council has changed names a couple times, but the Equity Council that has advanced proposals at Evergreen has proposed a revamping of our hiring process. They have proposed and are now moving forward with the hiring of an equity and inclusion vice president, who they have, by extension, increased the power by also making it a vice provost. And when asked about the nature of these things, in particular the vice president and vice provost position that we are now hiring for, they acknowledge that the purpose of this position is to limit faculty autonomy.
Faculty governance of the institution being to some degree compromised by the appointment of administrative personnel with a portfolio that touches to some degree on faculty prerogatives, justified by a quest for equity, but at least in the minds of some faculty, yourself I take as an example, questionable in terms of whether they're consistent with the best interest and long-term, integrity of the pedagogic enterprise in which you're engaged, where the faculty presumably ought to be in the position of making critical decisions, intellectual decisions, pedagogical decisions, and so on. Am I getting this correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're dancing around the issue a little bit, which is that a council that contains a minority of faculty, I mean, it's a third faculty and the rest is students, administrators, and staff, decided to alter the level of faculty autonomy. It has acknowledged in a faculty meeting that it didn't wish to talk to the faculty about limiting faculty autonomy, and it has advanced proposals which are nominally equitable. In other words, it doesn't mention who is to be to have their autonomy tinkered with by our new administrator, but it is. I don't think it is a stretch to imagine that an administrator whose purpose is to ensure equitable outcomes at the college will be more focused on some faculty than others. And, that might sound speculative, but I think what emerged in the protests actually quite validated my worst fears and actually beyond about what the vision that was being advanced was.
Were administrators who are part of the equity infrastructure of the college active participants in the events that surrounded, protest and remonstration in the aftermath of your comments about the day of absence?
Well, I'm not sure. In one way, yes, definitely. They were quite responsive to the protesters' demands, even when those demands were accompanied by threats of violence. So I would say, to the extent that they decided to refuse to reprimand the protesters at first, to refuse to utilize the code of conduct, that they invited more intimidation, and so they were complicit in that way. Were they participants in planning it? I would have no way of knowing.
Okay, let me ask you this, because when I think about faculty prerogatives in a university context and encroachment thereon, the first thing I think about is appointments to the faculty. That is, the evaluation of people who are going to be made assistant professor, associate professor, professor, who are going to be granted tenure, who are going to be given a portfolio and the autonomy to work on that in terms of the missions of teaching and research at the college. Are you concerned at Evergreen State College that the urge to diversify the faculty by appointing more people of color and people from historically underrepresented groups, that the desire to pursue that goal and the interest of equity is compromising the intellectual standards that would otherwise be applied to making decisions about faculty appointments?
Yes, and in fact, this impinges on this discussion in two important ways. The first place that I ran afoul of the Equity Coalition was when they advanced a proposal that required, so we write self-evaluations every year, and they held a vote on a proposal in which our union would negotiate into our contracts a requirement that we reflect on our own progress with respect to issues of equity and racism in our annual self-evaluations. And, you know, I don't think objected reflect on things, but
I'm sorry, Bret.
That is.
Excuse me for interrupting. Can you repeat the last sentence or two, because I don't think I quite got it here.
Sure. The Equity Coalition, the first proposal that came to our attention was one in which we essentially required ourselves to engage in an annual self-reflection on our own personal progress with respect to issues of race and equity. And, you know, had we simply been required to reflect privately, I think it raises questions, but I wouldn't have objected. But we were actually required, we have now voted to require ourselves to reflect on these things publicly in our self-evaluations, which then does become fodder for questions of promotion, hiring people from visiting status to permanent status and the like, and I think has terrible implications for what people will decide about who to teach with on what topics. So we team teach very frequently, and one does not want to be put in a position, you know, sometimes team teaching doesn't work out. I've only had one program in my history at the college not work out, but programs failing is not so unusual. And for such a thing to fail in a context where there is official requirements to document one's own views on race that are then reviewed by, so it struck me as dangerous, and I spoke up and I said so. I said, you know, I agree with the values that are being pursued here, but I don't agree that this mechanism is very wise.
Let me make an observation that reflects back to how we started this conversation, where you were talking about yourself being an evolutionary biologist. If you're going to be an experimental institution, which I understand that the Evergreen State College understands itself to be, experiments are going to produce good and bad outcomes. That's why you do experiments, which means they're going to be failures. I mean, it's built into the cake that they're going to be. If you layer over the top of the experimental orientation a kind of code of implicit, everybody's got to be on the same page because we all want, you know, to do good and to be on the right side of history, you prevent the judgmental mechanisms that weed out the failed experiments from actually being able to operate, because people won't feel secure to be candid in their assessments about what's going on. I mean, that strikes me as a very a deep problem and a very interesting problem. You think I'm accurate in this description?
Oh, 100%. I would say if you really want the experimental pedagogy to work well, you have to expect failures, as you say. If you're not failing, then you're not taking enough risk.
Right.
And if you want people to be willing to fail enough that they discover things that are new, then they have to feel safe enough to do it. And this did exactly the opposite. It made us feel imperiled that, anything we did would potentially be fodder for disciplinary action, or in the case of people who aren't tenured, that they wouldn't be promoted. You also asked about hiring, and this is a different issue. But in the equity proposal that the Equity Council advanced this year, although they were not supposed to engage the question of hiring at all, they took it on themselves to propose a brand new way of hiring for the college, which I find very disturbing, because as much as I don't think Evergreen does hiring very well, we teach so differently at Evergreen from almost everywhere, I think, in the world, certainly in the country, that we have to hire for people who have a different skill set. Nobody teaches you how to teach at a place like Evergreen. You have to discover it. And so we're really looking for people, or should be looking for people, who have a taste for that. And one thing that has to be true is that the population of people from whom you're drawing has to be as large as possible in order to find the rare individuals that have a taste for inventing new ways of teaching. It can't help but be true that if you prioritize race above everything else, that you're limiting the size of the population of people from whom you're drawing. So I think there's actually a cryptic trade-off here, which is your objective to diversify the faculty along one line, which is racial diversity, at the cost to the students of having the highest quality faculty that you can provide them? Or are you going to prioritize what students get in the classroom and do so at some cost to diversity of skin color, for example? And I don't pretend that that's a simple question. I do think there is a value to having many different kinds of diversity, but that tension is one that we have to recognize.
I think you're putting your finger right now on something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and that is, I call it the problem of self-censorship in public discourse. And people will think immediately political correctness, social justice warriors, race and ethnicity, but I think the problem is much, much deeper. And the problem arises from the need to make inferences about the motives of other people when we engage in argument or discussion. I mean, we have that need because people's motives are not self-evident, and because we are social animals who may want to impose sanction on those who act from the wrong motives, who are racist, for example, who don't value social justice, for example, in a community where that's a very important value. So there could be an issue that has nothing explicitly and directly to do with racism or social justice, like how do you hire people for the faculty, or how do you organize team teaching efforts, or how do you evaluate people's performance. It could be an issue like that that's not directly, and on which people have different views, but that it comes to be the case that to take a particular kind of stance, say, for example, you had doubts about affirmative action. Maybe you thought the standards were being lowered for the admission of people to the college. I'm not saying you do think this. I'm not saying this at all. I'm saying hypothetically. Suppose a person thought so. They believe in diversity. They believe in bringing more Black and Latino students to the campus. They want it to be a diverse campus, but they're worried that the kids who are being brought in aren't prepared for the work. Suppose that's the case, and that they're being patronized and not really getting the benefit of being taken seriously in terms of the educational process because no one's prepared to recognize the deficiencies of their preparation coming in, recognize and address those deficiencies. And you give voice to this in the context of deliberation over how to diversify the student body, and people impute to you the motive that you don't value diversity, that you really don't care about the Black students, that you really wanted, you only think white people can be smart scientists, something like that. That's a certain kind of problem that you see in a lot of different places, and the consequence of that can be that people clam up or adopt a very self-protective posture in which they're very careful about what they say, and they truncate their contribution to deliberation because they don't want to be thought bad people. And disastrous, in the case of affirmative action, I don't necessarily think so, but in the case of, let's say, marching to war in Iraq in 2003 behind the patriotic flag wavers, where you might be reluctant to speak up because you don't want to be thought to be, on the wrong side of history in terms of protecting the country from its, quote, enemies, close quote, or in the case of endorsing a political candidate. Anyway, I could go on, and I shouldn't because this is we want to talk about your stuff. But I do think in the areas of race, equity, inclusion, diversity, and so on, there's a lot of this. I share the value, but I don't agree with the method being met by, no, you don't share the value, proof of which is that you don't agree with the method.
That is exactly what happened. And it has a terribly chilling effect on the discussion, which then leaves the impression that there is not a diversity of opinion. And I have come to think that this is, I don't know if it's conscious, but it's definitely a feature and not a bug, which is if you can get the people who view something in some other way not to speak up, so it appears that you have consensus, then things move along. And this is what I was saying at the beginning about once you have established a system in which people reflexively sign up for something based on the title of the document rather than the content of the document, or the label on the package rather than the contents, then it's a mechanism that will inherently be abused to advance policies that are either unwise or are designed to accomplish something other than what they're said to be designed for. And so I saw that very directly at Evergreen, and lots of people talked to me privately about sharing my concerns, but the number of people who were willing to stand up and say so was near zero.
Well, Bret, I thank you for your testimony because you're giving me ammunition in my ongoing debate with my friend and Blogging Heads colleague, John McWhorter, because John's view of all the brouhahas on campus is, it's about people who have a very deep feeling about certain things and, maybe they overstep, but, they are motivated by their fervent religious or quasi-religious commitment to a certain set of ideals. And my response is, well, yeah, but you know what? It's also about power. It's also about a grab for power and control, defining the agenda, defining what can legitimately be said, controlling the portals of entry, controlling the decisions about resource allocation and so forth. Power, P-O-W-E-R. So I'm putting you down as a piece of evidence on my side of the ledger in that debate. But anyway, I want to talk. Yeah, go ahead. You have something to say?
Yeah, I would say that actually, it's important to track. He's got a point. I think most of the people who are nominally signed up for this actually are what he's suggesting. But that does not mean that they are setting the agenda for it. So, it happens that I can see this well inside of Evergreen because I know the players. But the majority of people have signed up based on too little information. And in fact, the documents are written, so you have to read them really carefully. You have to invest the time in order to understand how they would unfold in practice. Otherwise, they just read like dry academic insanity. But the difference between what structures the agenda and what the population that signed up for the agenda thinks it's about is large. And you have to track both things because, if you track the power dynamic, then you'll react as I did and you end up, on the other end of a mob. But if you track what the majority thinks it's doing, you'll understand why there is power in advancing these policies. So yes, you have to track the power part very definitely, but it doesn't mean that everybody who's pushing these things knows what they're doing.
Okay, well, let's talk about you a little bit more. I think I caught you twice on Tucker Carlson's show on the Fox News channel. Not that I watch it every night. Yep. But somebody told me he was on, and therefore I think I caught you twice. Now, that's Tucker Carlson. That's Fox News. You know the world that we live in, the political world that's so polarized and whatnot. What self-respecting, left of center, dedicated 20-year veteran of teaching at Evergreen State College in Washington State allows himself to be used by the right-wing mouthpieces of this world in order to push their propaganda? Pardon me for putting it so sharply, but I think that's a question on a lot of people's minds.
No, I'm glad you're asking it. Well, first of all, you should know, and I've said this multiple times, but somehow the story that I ran to Fox News is so powerful that it doesn't really matter that it's not true. Fox News came to me. In fact, I should say, I reached out to you about having this conversation, but you are literally the only person that I have reached out to because I thought this conversation had the potential to be so valuable that it was worth initiating.
Well, thanks very much, Bret. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm glad you agreed to do it, and I'm enjoying it already. So anyway, Tucker Carlson reached out to me, and he said, "Would you like to come on?" And at that point, the story was absurd within the college, but it was not understood outside the college at all. And so my sense was this story needs daylight as a disinfectant. What I'm watching is so preposterous and so dangerous that, they're going to do the story either way, and it's better if I'm there to say, to give a nuanced view rather than to have a caricature portrayed. And B, this story just simply needs to be broken. And the degree to which the nominally left-leaning press has still not dealt with this story is amazing to me. So I have zero regrets about going on Tucker Carlson. I should also say there is a tension between two interpretations of what happened as a result of my going on Fox News. One is the one the college has been advancing, which is that the world moved to the right and the threat of alt-right violence came to the campus as a result of my going on Fox News. And the other one is a bit more subtle, but my email inboxes suggest it is the more powerful interpretation, which is that the audience of Fox News had a pretty interesting reaction to seeing somebody that was unapologetically progressive with respect to his values that was in the position that I was in. And so the number of emails that I got that said some version of, I don't think we agree politically, but it's refreshing to see somebody on the other side that I can respect. I got hundreds of emails that had some version of that. I also discovered something I didn't expect, which was that Fox News reaches a lot of people that you wouldn't expect it to reach. So there are all kinds of people that are watching Fox News that do not fall into the category that we tend to associate with Tucker Carlson's audience. So I got emails from all over the world, in fact. One that particularly stood out was a guy who had seen that first appearance on Fox News, who was building schools in Uganda, and he contacted me to thank me for going on Fox News and alerting him to the story and all, and it was quite a good letter. But anyway, the tenor of the letters that came back from that appearance shocked me, and I think of myself as very open-minded. I have friends across the political spectrum, and I relish talking to people that I don't agree with, maybe even more than talking to people I do agree with, because it's profitable to discover how they see things. And I was not prepared for how insightful and dynamic the response to stuff on Fox News was going to be. So I learned something in that process.
That's very interesting. So if Chris Hayes or Rachel Maddow had called you, you would have been happy to go on MSNBC and tell your story there. Or maybe even you would have preferred to do so.
At that point, I would have preferred to do so. Now that I see how the college has reacted, and it's basically, its charge of heresy or blasphemy or whatever it is that it's reacting to, and the false way that it has portrayed the response to that appearance actually makes me feel emboldened in the sense that actually tell me who I shouldn't talk to, and that's where I'm going to go. Because I don't believe anymore that I have an obligation to stay away, that certain airwaves are poisoned or something like that. Now, if Carlson had treated me differently, if he had been more exploitative or something, I would have a different reaction. But, in general, I have the sense that he and I overlap in our commitment to the idea that free speech is essential to a thinking nation, and that it needs defense. So I'm not ashamed of that overlap, and I don't feel that I made a mistake going on Fox News. That said, I didn't initiate it.
Okay, that's useful information, and I certainly see where you're coming from. I read that Evergreen State chose to hold its commencement ceremonies this year at a site off campus, some distance off campus, in a sports stadium because of concerns about security if the event were to have been held at the college. What's up with that?
Well, they held it in Tacoma, and Evergreen has a campus in Tacoma. So, in some ways it's home turf, but it's definitely, I think, unprecedented that it was held off campus at all. And I think they did have very real security concerns, and I don't think it was the wrong move. It was certainly an expensive move. I don't think they were fully clear about what their concerns were. The fact is, outsiders might have shown up and disrupted the graduation ceremony, and that was worth protecting against. But so much of the agitating, and in fact the worst forms of agitating, have come from our campus, that the portrayal that the real danger to Evergreen is, the alt-right, is just simply off base with respect to what's actually taking place. This is visible if you take the time to look at the videotape, for example, of the Patriot Prayer free speech rally on campus and the response to it by the Antifa. So I don't know if you're aware of that event, but
I've heard about it. I didn't look at the video. I've heard about it. And you're saying that much of the instigation to violence is coming from the left.
Well, I don't even think of them as the left anymore. But yes. Okay. So what happened? So, I don't know much about Patriot Prayer. I wasn't even aware of them until they announced they were coming to Evergreen. And I've done some looking, and I've seen what's been said about them. And I also paid very close attention to what they said before they entered the campus. They, gave some speeches, and I listened very carefully. And, they're economically decidedly right of center. They're libertarian in orientation, and they obviously are unashamed about having religious views. But the discussion that they had outside the campus before they came on campus actually sounded more progressive than much of what I hear on the campus these days. In other words, they were very clear about being tolerant of people of different genders, and not just male and female, but they talked about transgender people. They talked about essentially everybody having a right to be on the campus and being incensed by, day of absence and the shutting down of free speech. So, I don't know, could that have been a front? I suppose. But if I take them at their word that what they were saying at their rally represented their actual views, I didn't find anything noxious about it at all. Whereas when they went on the campus, they were physically assaulted. At first that was silly string, which that's a pretty symbolic assault, I would say. But then at the point that the silly string ran out, the cans that were dispensing the silly string were thrown in their faces. One of them had pepper spray sprayed into his eyes. This is a little hard to track because the camera didn't catch it, but it appears that an Antifa person pulled a knife, and then one of the Patriot Prayer people disarmed him and held him down as the police came to take him away. So all of the violence that occurred actually came from, it's hard to say if they were students because the Antifa wear masks, so it's hard to say even who they were. But it did not come from the people who had been described as white supremacist, alt-right folks. It came from people who were counter-protesting. So the college is promoting a narrative in which the danger is the result of me, Fox News, and white supremacists. But the damage to the college and the violence that I've seen has all come from the other side.
Has there been any disciplinary action directed against members of the college community for the way in which they may have conducted themselves in this, in the midst of this controversy, that are the ways in which they may have done so that are contrary to the college's rules and regulations?
Well, it's a little hard for me to say. I don't know. They are not talking to me about what they've done. Initially, it was very clear that the president primarily did exactly the opposite. And in fact, he, thanked the protesters for holding us to account and all sorts of absurdities, did not enforce the student code of conduct against people who had disrupted my class. So at first, the answer is an emphatic no. Then the president, at some point, it became clear what the college was doing was drawing the ire of a large fraction of the people who were paying attention in the outer world. And the president appeared to pivot and say that, in fact, disciplinary action needed to happen. But what the disciplinary action has been or will be hasn't been stated. I haven't been told anything about events that involve me, including apparently having been, I can't think of another word for it except being hunted on my own campus. For what purpose, I don't know.
By whom?
But
by whom?
By protesters. So the protest at my class happened on Tuesday. Several other events happened on that Tuesday, May 23rd. And then on Wednesday, I did not have class, so I was off campus. And the police contacted me, and they asked in an agitated way whether I was on campus at that moment. And I told them no, and they said, don't come to campus. And I said, why? And they said, protesters are searching car to car. They're inquiring from occupants of these cars what their role at the university or the college is. And they say they're hunting for an individual, and we think it's you. And then the next day I did have class, and I decided to hold it off campus because I didn't want, obviously, to have a run-in with these protesters. And I ended up experiencing something where people were, it appeared to me, so my route to campus is reasonably well known. I live close to campus, and I take the same route to campus every day. And it appeared that there were people watching for me and communicating my location, which at first I thought I must be imagining this. And I went to the police station. I talked to the chief, Stacy Brown, and I said, I've got to be imagining this, but I had this experience. And she said, I don't think you're imagining it at all. And then she said, I don't want you riding your bike because I don't know what will happen if you are encountered by these protests somewhere. So go home, put your bike away, take the car, and don't be on campus.
I just want to, forgive me, I just want to underscore how extraordinary this is. I mean, here you have a university, you have a member of the faculty, you have a controversial email. And the result of that is that the fury inspired by the professor's controversial email results in a circumstance where he dare not ride his bicycle through the campus grounds for fear that a group of agitated persons, we don't know exactly who they are or what they might intend to do, would find him, and security personnel cautioning against appearing on the campus? This is not okay. People, this is not normal. This is not okay.
There's nothing okay
That's
about
the end of my sermon. But I mean, man, that blows me away.
It blew me away too. I mean, just the simple, I had to check with myself a dozen times. I'm experiencing actually being hunted, in the United States in 2017 on my own campus for a disagreement over the propriety of policies at the college. And if I can add one other thing, sure. There's a fact that gets lost in this whole controversy that I think needs to be emphasized, which is overwhelmingly students who know me were shocked by what took place, because the portrayal of me as a racist that needs to be confronted is completely inconsistent with the person that they know. I mean, for one thing, in talking about human evolution and human history, I deal with issues of race. And so, they've heard me on this topic and they know my perspective, which is it cannot be reconciled with the portrayal that the protesters gave, and it cannot be reconciled with the college's response to those protesters. So they were students who protested. I know that many of them were, but they were not students who knew me. They were students responding to a false portrayal of me, and it got to the point of actually apparently physically hunting. And then within the next couple of days, while I don't think it had anything in particular to do with me, protesters were roving the campus with baseball bats. Now, they said they were doing it for their own protection, but this has become a trope of the protest, is that going after people's personal information and distributing it online, carrying baseball bats, all of this is about self-protection, which doesn't add up. But that is nonetheless the portrayal. But as you say, there's nothing okay about it.
Well, what about those students who know you not to be a racist so far as they're concerned, speaking up? Have they done so? Have there been pieces in the university, the newspaper, or meetings where some of those students might have been brave enough to say, well, he may not be right about everything, but he's not such a bad guy. I know he's not what you say he is. Have they done that?
Oh, yeah. Quite a number of them have done that. And in particular, there was a meeting at 4:00 on the day of the initial protest. And it's a meeting that became, to my view and to the police's view, extremely dangerous. We were essentially hundreds of us in a room in which the protesters controlled the exits, and it appeared to nearly boil over into violence several times, with people calling for my job, if not my head. So anyway, it's a very tense meeting. But in that meeting, 2 students of color of mine stood up and attempted to point out that the portrayal was completely invalid. And they were, astonishingly enough, shouted down. And they were, in fact, this still stuns me, they were told that they did not understand their own experience. Students who had not been mine told students who were my students that they misunderstood their own experience of my teaching and that they needed to be schooled so that they could understand it.
Yeah, he must be a racist. He must be a racist. As it happens, I'm reading Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. And if you've not ever read it, it's a classic, of course. Everybody knows it's about the Salem witch hunt of the early 18th century. And it's absolutely brilliant. And an allegory for our time, I'm afraid to say. He wrote it during the McCarthy scare, the terror of anti-communist witch hunting. And it's very clear in his notes that he intends to be speaking to that issue. But there are so many parallels. And this, don't believe your lying eyes, right? The guy might sound like he's not a racist, but because he objects to this policy, he has to be a racist / has to be a witch. It's pretty interesting. What's in the future for you, man? Are you going back in September?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. So on the one hand, I don't have another plan, and I should say this is doubly bad. I have 2 young kids, and my wife has the identical job, and she has also been caught up in this. So at some level, we have 2, our entire income stream comes from the college, and we don't have another plan for next year. On the flip side, when you've been hunted on your own campus and the administration refuses to acknowledge that it took place, one cannot imagine that the sense that nothing is wrong and that you'd be safe to go back to class is real. You would have to admit first that something took place in order to explain why it was not in danger of happening again. And so the college has, instead of investing in solving the problem and restoring public safety, they've invested in a PR campaign to portray everything that went wrong as the result of my going on Fox News. And so I have to go back and I can't go back. I don't know what that means.
Forgive me for maybe overstepping bounds here, and I'm not a lawyer, but if there were ever a hostile environment labor action case to be brought with respect, this would appear to be one of them, okay? Again, it's not normal and it's not okay that a guy can't get to his office without worrying about the safety of him or his family. And the institution's non-response, again, if I'm wrong about this, please correct me, would appear to be legally actionable neglect of their responsibilities to employees. I mean, so it would appear to me, but you know.
Yeah, well, it appears that way to me and to many legal authorities as well. So, you know, I will say I do not relish having to resort to the courts. On the other hand, you know, courts do two things. They adjudicate matters of fact and matters of law. And the college has been so deliberate in misportraying the facts and left effectively no other option but to take this to a court and say, well, can we at least establish what actually happened so that we can then get to the question of, you know, the college's legal obligation to make the campus safe. I mean, yes, it was not only hostile, which doesn't necessarily involve the threat of violence, but it actually became physically violent and demonstrably so to anybody who spends time looking at the videos. I mean, it's there on the tape.
Bret, I appreciate you talking with me. I want to give you an opportunity for a last word, if there were anything that hasn't been said yet that you think would be important to say.
Yeah, I guess there is something. It is very important that we figure out how to navigate issues of race so that we can talk about them productively. And the current climate is really destructive of our ability to have that conversation. In order to have that conversation, one needs to establish trust enough to be able to hear what each other's saying and to speak candidly. And the events that I've been through have convinced me that my fears about where we are in that conversation are justified, and maybe we're even too conservative. And so I would just say it is time for us to speak courageously and plainly and candidly with each other, and to not parse each other's words such that we are looking to confirm our biases, but so that we can actually hear what's being said. So anyway, I hope this conversation begins to open the door to more candor, because really the solution to the problems that we do have with respect to race requires that candor.
That's well said. For what it's worth, I concur wholeheartedly. And I think we had such a conversation here. I'm sure some listeners will think that, quote, the other side didn't get adequate representation. And all I have to say is I regret that. And I'm happy to have another conversation with other people interested in this issue, where other perspectives could be brought to bear. I can't help but identify with my man, Bret Weinstein here. And that's where my sympathies lie based on what I know right now. But I'm open to further discussion of this issue if there's anybody who is interested in doing it. Anybody at Evergreen State who's interested in doing it. How about one of those administrators who's responsible for diversity and inclusion and equity affairs at Evergreen State? Welcome to the Glenn Show, Administrator. I'd love to hear from you. Okay. Bret, thanks a lot. I'm gonna sign us off now.
This has been excellent. Thanks so much, Glenn.
You're welcome.